September 12, 1943. 2:33 p.m. Tonopah Army Airfield, Nevada. 3 P-51s lift into dry blue and angle east over the Great Salt Lake Desert. Radios clear. Fuel topped. Weather perfect. 30 minutes later, silence swallows the flight. No distress call. No fleck. No sighting. At 3:05 p.m., the control tower logs a broken transmission. A half sentence, clipped mid-word, then nothing. What happened to Lieutenant Jack Mercer and his two wingmen between Tonopah's runway and Skull Valley's White Flats? Their commanders call it routine. Their families call every base they can find. The desert says nothing. 65 years later, a machine clawing a drainage trench will hit something that should not be there, and the story will start moving again. For now, all we have is a clock, a line on a map, and a gap where voices should be. Someone arrived before the rescuers, and they never left. Mercer was 24, habit of writing in the margin of maps. He believed neat pencil lines could tame chaos. Cole Redding, 26, flew hard and clean, the one who went back for anyone who hesitated in weather. Luis Ortega, 21, youngest by years, older by intuition, the kind who stepped away from noise to listen for the thing no one else could hear. On the morning of the mission, all three signed the same maintenance form. Fuel, magnetos, gun cameras, removed for calibration, a note no one remembered requesting. The crew chief, Sergeant Dwyer, kept eyes on his boots as a technical team. Mercer had never met eased a small diaphragm assembly into a place it did not belong. They called it a governor. It looked like a veto. The briefing was shorter than breakfast. No new German activity. No weather fronts. No reason for extended range tanks, yet the orders included them. The map changed color. The line cut toward a sector pilots had been told to avoid for a month. The colonel tapped the paper with a pencil eraser and looked over their heads. Routine patrol, boys. Confirm radio check every 15 minutes. When Mercer raised a hand to ask why the route had shifted, the answer was a stare that closed the door. He lowered his hand. They walked out into a light so bright the hangar's shadow looked like shelter. They climbed on schedule. Tower had them until the flats began to molt into heat shimmer. A lone freight truck threw a dust comma on a distant road. Ortega said his teeth ached, a thing he said when weather built from nowhere. Mercer wrote a time in the margin of his knee board. Redding said he could smell rain that did not exist. At 2:47 p.m., a fragment came through. We've got, the signal folded. The tower called. No reply. 3 minutes later, the controller logged an anomaly. The line went cold like a switch flipped in someone else's hand. Search planes lifted before sunset. They drew grids over a map that gave back only light and salt and mirage. 2 days, then a third cut short by wind. They found tire tracks, a pile of bleached cattle ribs. A coffee can with a bullet hole rusted into a grim smile. They did not find 3 aircraft or oil sheen or burnt sage or anything that explained how points on a radar scope could vanish so neatly you might mistake it for planning. On day 4, the colonel signed the recommendation. Missing, presumed dead. He sent letters that praised duty and sacrifice and contained no coordinates. In Portland, a folded flag went into a triangle-glassed box. In Albuquerque, a gold star replaced a silver one in a window. In San Antonio, Ortega's mother kept his last postcard under a plate at dinner like a prayer. The war moved on, then ended, then hardened into monuments. The desert moved less. Sand climbed fences. Salt made crust beside old tire ruts. Skies kept their blunt, merciless beauty. In 2008, contractors broke ground on a drainage ditch west of Skull Valley's Ranch Road. Sun hammered the flats. The backhoe coughed, shuddered, and stopped against metal set too deep to be trash and too orderly to be luck. They called a county man, who called another, who took one look and decided this wasn't a county matter at all. The first piece they lifted was not a wing or a wheel. It was a canopy frame, too whole for a crash, too clean for wreckage, the kind of artifact that shouldn't sit 12 feet under salt unless someone put it there. A second frame. Then something like a seat harness, leather gone to stiff dark, buckles still catching light. If you stand where the machines did and look east, The flats glare until your eyes water and every straight line wavers. You might imagine 3 fighters gliding low with no engine note, riding air as if it were memory, not physics. You might imagine a convoy you can't quite see waiting behind a line of willow scrub, dust held in hand the way a magician holds breath. You might imagine a decision made in a windowless room that afternoon, one that required silence more than sky. But imagining is not proof, and proof is what families were denied. What matters is that the desert gave something back, and once it did, it kept giving because secrets hate daylight more than anything. There is a version of this story where maintenance was sloppy, radios were fickle, and fate rolled snake eyes over Utah. The version we will follow begins earlier, in a hangar where a sergeant stared at his boots and wrote his name beside a part he didn't install. It continues in a ledger where a route changed without a reason and a signature smudged in a hurry. It tightens around a blank space between 2 times stamped in ink. And it points toward those flats, where the sound of engines never carried and the ground accepted what the air returned. The first shovel of salt turned up metal, and everything else started to move. Ask yourself one question and hold it. Who buried 3 perfect silences in a straight line? Ava Mercer didn't expect the attic to smell like metal and rain. Portland was drenched that morning in 2018, the kind of steady gray that softens edges and slows time. But when she cracked the rattle-worn trunk beside a box of holiday lights, air rushed out with a cold, preserved tang. On top lay Jack's dress jacket folded square, pilot wings pinned where a heartbeat would be. Beneath it, a manila folder, the paper gone brittle at the corners, and a cloth-wrapped bundle tied with a shoelace knotted twice as if someone meant to delay a future pair of hands. She sat on the floorboards and untied it. A map of Utah unfurled across her knees, Great Salt Lake Desert sketched in pale pencil, a rectangular block shaded hard and labeled, in Jack's careful block print, Sector 9. Her name surfaced in a familiar ache. She had grown up on the legend of duty and loss. She had not grown up on sectors. The folder held a maintenance card stamped September 11, 1943, signatures in graphite, the boldest belonging to a sergeant named Dwyer. In the margin, a line Ava would have missed if she wasn't the kind of person who teaches freshmen how to read between lines. Fuel governors installed per directive. Governors where? She knew enough to know there were places you didn't put them. The last page was the kind that ends conversations. A scrap of paper stained a rusted brown, torn from a larger sheet. For words, in a hand that matched the neat letters on the map. They chose silence for us. Her phone buzzed on the rafters, a number with no caller ID. She let it die. She turned the map over and found a small steel plate tucked inside the fold, the weight of a coin, engraved 1544. A bank tag. Denver, she guessed, from the style. Jack had never set foot in Colorado, not as far as family stories went. She lifted the trunk's false bottom out with fingernails and a grunt. The cavity hid a compact camera, empty of film. A pocket journal with entries to September 11th and then nothing but indents, as if the pen had pressed through, writing on a page no one ever saw, and a letter unsent, addressed to a wife he'd last kissed beneath a porch light in Nevada. Ava did not read it. Not yet. She was not ready for his voice. When she set the journal down, the attic light flickered. Her phone buzzed again, the same number, then a text that pushed the day colder. Stop digging, historian. The next box won't be yours. She stared at those plain words and felt something old shift inside, a hinge unsticking. Fear came first, then a steadier thing that felt like hunger. This wasn't folklore and folded flags. Someone had kept a lock on a story that didn't belong to them, and they knew her name. The manila folder contained a photocopy of a document Ava had only seen in archives behind polite smiles. A daily search report, Tonopah to Skull Valley, dated September 13, 1943. Duration, 1 day. Weather, favorable. Wreckage, none. Recommendation, M.A. Kia. Signature, Colonel Richard Harlan. She ran her thumb across the ink and felt nothing but paper. 1 day. The letters to families had implied diligence, air crews over grid squares until the fuel ran dry. 1 day meant a decision, not a failure. She looked at the map again, at the hard graphite rectangle, At the tiny star Jack had drawn near a dry wash no one visited unless they had to. Downstairs, the house was still dismantled from the funeral. A casserole dish sat unsampled on the counter. Cards in a neat stack offered a kind of kindness that cannot help. Ava poured coffee that had cooled to the temperature of regret and opened her laptop. She cross-referenced Jack's squadron logs against the official mission board. Routine patrols had notes about weather fronts, enemy sightings, training anomalies. The entry for September 12th stood out by its lack. Route adjusted, gun cameras pulled for calibration. No attached justification. She checked procurement ledgers digitized by volunteers and found an odd requisition log the night before. 3 extended-range tanks, requested and approved outside the usual chain. Feet away, Rain shouldered at the window and backed off like someone who'd changed his mind. It wasn't just the paper. A photo fell from the map like a confession. 3 men, hats crooked, arms thrown across shoulders the way young aircrew did when they knew the camera belonged to living. Jack stood in the middle with Cole Redding's grin collapsed into a laugh and Luis Ortega trying to look older than he was, jaw set, eyes soft. Someone had scrawled on the back in a different hand, neat but more hurried. Last night, Reno. Don't let them say we were careless. Ava placed the image beside the journal and felt the weight of 3 lives tilt her desk. The text pinged again, a second number now, then a third, each with the same spare tone. You misread that ledger. Sector 9 does not exist. People get hurt when they misread. The threat was sloppy in its deniability. It still did its work. Fear thrummed beneath her ribs. But another thought came, as simple as opening a door. If they were this quick to interrupt, the trunk had triggered a wire someone left decades ago. The line was still hot. That meant the story had never actually cooled. She printed the maintenance card and the search memo and slid them into a clean folder. On the first page of a new notebook, she wrote a sentence she would read aloud later without shaking. If truth is heavy, carry it with both hands. Then she did the thing she tells her students to do when the archive fights back. She stepped closer, not away. If you've been with us this far, stay with this investigation. Not as spectators, but as witnesses. We are going to follow a steel tag stamped 1544 to a door someone thought would never open. We are going to stand in a vault and ask for a box that remembers what men forgot on purpose. We are going to walk a straight line from Tonopah's runway to Skull Valley's salt and see where it bends. The story does not owe us comfort. It owes us clarity. Her phone hummed one more time, quiet as a throat clearing. This time it wasn't a threat. It was a photo, low resolution and mean, of a bank lobby with marble floors and brass rails. In the lower corner, a hand holds a card like hers. The caption read, "You're late." The key fits more than one lock, and someone else has been using it. Harvey Redding opened the door with both hands like a man accepting weight. Boise was clear and cold, the kind of dry that preserves words, and the apartment smelled faintly of furniture polish and old tobacco. He was 97, still tall, eyes the shade of prairie dusk. "You look like him," he said before she could speak. Ava tried to answer and found she didn't have a voice yet. He gestured her in, settled into a chair by a window, and slid a thin envelope across the table. The paper had been opened and closed so many times the crease was polished. "Cole sent this on September 10th, 43, Harvey said. "We had a code when we were kids. He used it again when he thought we were being listened to." Inside was a letter about the weather, dry and plain, except for words that didn't fit sitting one letter too deep, as if they carried stones in their pockets. When Ava read only those buried letters, a second message surfaced. Project Sequoia. Doctors relocated. Living cargo. Sector 9 spared from bombing. She went back through the lines a second time, looking for confirmation. The code held. Harvey tapped another sheet with a knuckle. "He called me the night before," he said. "Said the route had been changed. Said the gun cameras were gone. He laughed like he'd stepped into a spotlight and didn't want to make me worry, so he made it a joke." His mouth worked around a memory that hurt. He asked about Mom's peach tree. That's how I knew he was scared. Ava turned the page over. The back held a single pencil note written hard enough to emboss the fibers. "Dwyer says a new team touched our fuel." "Dwyer?" she asked. Sergeant at Tonopah, Harvey said. He had hands like vices and a face like a confession. Ava spread the documents like a map. 3 facts lined up too neatly to be luck: a route into a restricted block, gun cameras removed on the eve of the flight, and an unnamed team inserting a device into the fuel system. She had read enough maintenance logs to know a governor could regulate flow. She had read enough accident boards to know a remote cutoff could do more than regulate. She looked up. Did Cole ever say why Sector 9 was off limits? Harvey's silence was answer enough. He didn't know, he said finally. Only that somebody important wanted it to stay quiet. Skull Valley looked like it always had in October. Flat and pale, mountains stamped at the horizon like a diagram. Eleanor Voss met Ava at the fence line with a thermos and a gaze that did not blink. She was 93 and stood like a windbreak. "You're the granddaughter," she said. "I saw them when I was a girl." I stopped saying it out loud because people smile when they think you're remembering wrong. She pointed with the thermos toward a rectangle of ground that held a newer color of salt. "They came over with no engine sound," she said. "I could see the pilots. One in the middle turned his head. They were talking with their hands. They weren't shot. They weren't on fire. They were flying like the sky had decided to be water." Ava pictured Jack's wrist working the trim with nothing to push against but drag, Cole keeping position, Ortega counting heartbeats. "They landed there, and there," Eleanor said, and her finger made a triangle in the air. "They climbed out. The youngest stumbled. The tall one kept hold of him. Then the trucks came." Ava felt the way the air changed when a truth approached. "How fast?" she asked. Eleanor did not hesitate. "Too fast. Even if the tower called them, they were too fast. They were waiting." She took a sip of coffee and did not offer any. "Men wore American uniforms," she said. An officer with a hat pulled low. "They didn't aim guns, not like at a battle. They used ropes." She closed her eyes a moment. The tall one kept saying he had photographs. He said, "You can't bury what you did." The officer said, "You don't have anything anymore." He had a voice like a hinge. Ava asked to see the place where the machines had bitten salt and metal. Eleanor walked her out, boots scuffing crust. "When they started digging for the ditch," she said, "I came back. I thought maybe I'd been wrong all these years. Then I saw the canopy. It was too clean. Nobody in town buried them. We don't bury planes in neat lines. Whoever did it had time and orders." She handed Ava an old aerial photo in a plastic sleeve. The paper was cracked, the image clear enough. In a clump of willows just off the flats, a fence threw a shadow, a guard tower made a thin cross, and in a corner of the frame a truck carried a red cross that looked painted over in a hurry. "My cousin took that from a crop duster a week later," Eleanor said. "He got scared and put it in a drawer. His son gave it to me when he died." Ava's phone trembled in her pocket again. A new number. A single image. A 1940s technical diagram of AP-51 fuel system with a red circle where a governor had no business being. A caption followed a breath later. That part belonged to a test range, not a patrol. She saved the picture to a folder named after nothing and looked back at the triangle Eleanor's hand had drawn. The flats were quiet in that heavy way deserts keep faith. On the drive back toward Salt Lake, Ava stopped at a diner that had survived trends by ignoring them. She spread the letter, the photo, and a print of the diagram on the formica and traced the same triangle that had been drawn in air and salt and steel. 3 planes lost power at once. 3 radios died. 3 trucks arrived before the nearest rescue could have turned a wheel. She needed a new word for coincidence that meant the opposite. When she climbed into the car, a voicemail waited. The voice sounded old and educated and used to winning arguments by not raising itself. "Ms. Mercer, my name is Martin Shepard," it said. "Years ago some people called me Dr. Edwin Blackwell. I knew your grandfather. If you want to know what Sector 9 protected, come to Fish Springs tomorrow at dawn. Bring the key." The man who built the door was offering to unlock it himself. The bank in downtown Denver wore its age like a medal. Marble cooled by air older than Ava, brass that held fingerprints from 3 generations of worry. The tag engraved 1544 turned in the clerk's hand, and a series of quiet nods passed between employees in dark suits as if some protocol older than their name badges had been awakened. In the vault, the air went drier still. The attendant slid out a small, dull gray safe deposit box, unremarkable among 1,000 twins. Ava's key found home as if it had been waiting for this hour alone. When the lid lifted, the smell was dust and film and gun oil. Inside lay 3 canisters of microfilm nested in felt, a sealed envelope marked in pencil, for family only, and a Colt sidearm wrapped in oiled cloth, 1 chamber empty. The weight of each object said the same thing. Someone expected a siege. Hans Muller, the vault officer, produced a microfilm reader with the ceremony of an archivist. Grain bloomed into words and images. Transfer orders stamped September 1943 bore Colonel Richard Harlan's clean signature authorizing medical personnel relocation, Sequoia, with a destination listed as SEC-9 Transit, no latitude, no town. A second frame unspooled bills of lading for hospital supplies far beyond a field infirmary's hunger, warming apparatus, pressure chambers, files of surgical instruments, crates of saline, typed like a grocery list for a crisis without a storm. Then the photographs arrived. Sector 9 appeared from a high angle, fence lines drawn like a blueprint on dirt. Guard towers squared the corners. Trucks carried U.S. markings, their stencils bright against canvas. In one frame, a red cross had been painted over in a hurry. The outline bled through like a ghost. Through a window, stainless steel flashed under harsh light. No bodies. No gore. No sensational cruelty frozen for shock. Just rooms built for procedures and men standing to observe. Ava read quickly but not carelessly. A contract followed, ink dry and mercenary. An American pharmaceutical firm, still a household name, agreed to evaluate data continuity from ongoing physiological trials under the supervision of Army intelligence, with Sequoia as the conduit. Payment structures bypassed standard appropriations. Non-disclosure ran to a lifetime measured not in years but in descendants. Harlan initialed every page, neat, consistent, like a man accustomed to seeing plans through. She broke the pencil-marked envelope with hands that did not feel like hers. Jack's handwriting was contained, unadorned. He noted the route change, the gun cameras pulled, the governors we didn't request, and a sentence that fit too many rooms at once. If I'm right, it isn't the enemy making us disappear. He tucked a steel key in the fold, smaller than a house key, longer than a diary's lock, stamped with a shape and number she recognized from land records. The map reference matched a spot in the Fish Springs Range, a ragged patch of BLM scrub Jack had bought through a straw buyer 2 weeks before he vanished. He had never owned property in life. He had hidden it for death. At dawn, Fish Springs looked like the desert had shrugged off the night without a thought. The coordinates led to a hump of concrete under matting sage. The key turned a corroded hasp with a sound like a door clearing its throat. The hatch surrendered on the second pull. The ladder had flaked to raw metal. The air below was close but not sour, a sealed pocket of a year that never happened. When Ava's light swept the room, the shape of it became plain. A single chamber 10 feet by 10, 1 steel table, and along a wall 3 filing cabinets with Army numbers stamped into the faces. Each drawer was labeled in the same impatient block caps that had named Sector 9, Sequoia, Transit, Subjects. Then a 4th cabinet labeled different, Conduit. That drawer held no forms. It held a wrapped binder and a modern external drive tucked in anti-static foam like a foreign object in an old lung. "Please step carefully," a voice said from above, too calm to belong to surprise. Ava pivoted, light thrown up the ladder. An old man descended 1 slow rung at a time, expensive coat, careful shoes, a face that time had thinned but not softened. "Martin Shepard," he said, as if reading from a card. "They called me Edwin Blackwell when it was useful to be someone else." He extended empty hands. "I've been keeping this place alive longer than I had the right." He did not attempt to shake hers. He sat on the lower rung, breath steady, eyes on the cabinets. "I built it with your grandfather," he said. "He carried boxes while I carried fear." Shepard talked like a confession that had waited behind teeth for decades. Sector 9 was a transfer station dressed as Mercy. Not enemy work captured, but collaboration rebranded as capture. When the war bent toward its end, the program needed a bridge from battlefield chaos to peacetime budgets. Sequoia became the bridge. Jack had taken pictures because Shepard asked him to bring proof to a man in Washington who wanted the program dead. Harlan found out first. The fuel line governors were not governors. They were shutoffs wired to a frequency that belonged to the ground. Engines could be silenced from a room with no windows and a single switch. Outside, tires hissed on gravel. Shepard's mouth went tight. "They followed my call," he said. "I needed them to. I sent the drive last night to 50 places that don't answer to the same phone." The sound of doors opening carried down the shaft. Ava's light hit the cabinets again. The folders were original, not copies, signatures thick with pressure. Harlan wrote his name so cleanly it looked like a logo. Shepard held her gaze. "You wanted names and structures," he said. "Take them. Don't expect absolution to come with them." Boots rang on the ladder above. Ava closed one drawer, opened another, memorized 3 surnames that would ruin monuments. The hatch silhouette darkened with bodies. A voice with command in it told them to come up slow and show hands. The vault of truth had opened, and so had the trap. The record of September 12, 1943 doesn't exist in one place. It lives in fragments. A sergeant's signature pressed too hard, a route line that shifts a finger's width east, an old man's steady voice in a bunker, and 3 aircraft lifted whole from salt like artifacts of intention. Assemble them, and the last hours of Jack Mercer, Cole Redding, and Luis Ortega become visible through the glass of time, distorted at the edges, crisp in the center where the decisions were made. They rolled at 2:31 p.m., climbed clean, leveled east. Mercer checked the clock, tapped his knee board, and looked left to make sure Redding sat where he always did, 2 plane lengths off the wing, close enough to talk with a glove. Ortega's voice crackled something about static, then steadied. 15 minutes in, the first strangeness. An itch in the throttle that wasn't an engine problem so much as a refusal. Fuel pressure sat textbook. Power felt like it belonged to someone else. Mercer toggled tanks. No change. He kept it to himself for a breath. "Hold your spacing," he said. "We're fine." The ground below brightened into the pale of Skull Valley. The air thinned to that high desert clarity that makes distance a kind of lie. A fence line where no fence should be through a thread of shadow. A rectangle of roofs sat wrong in the emptiness. Redding said it first, because Redding always went blunt when he was afraid. "Jack, do you see that?" Mercer saw the flash of metal, the ghost of a red cross under fresh paint, a truck angled to a service door. He reached for the gun camera switch and touched absence. The lever had been removed and a blank plate stood in its place like a closed eye. At 2:47 p.m., the engine note collapsed in a way that had nothing to do with weather or where. 3 propellers spun without power as if the air had become syrup. Radios died an instant later. Silence between aircraft can feel like drowning. Mercer moved on training. Nose down, speed back, trim for best glide. "Triangle," he said to no one and everyone, and the formation tightened into a defensive geometry that made sense of fear. Terrain is story when the engine quits. He picked a pale patch of crust that might give instead of break. Redding read his mind because he always did. Ortega, whose teeth had ached at breakfast, rode the glide like a prayer given shape. They came in hard and honest, skidding, noses dipping, props bending, structure holding. 3 planes stopped in salt within shouting distance and did not catch fire. That part matters. The Earth didn't take them as wrecks. It accepted them as offerings. They were out of the cockpits when the trucks arrived, which should be impossible if the trucks had started then. They did not start then. They had been waiting. Men in American uniforms moved with an efficiency that is its own language. No shooting. No panic. One officer wore authority like a well-cut suit, Harlan, by Shepard's later account, hat brim pulled low, eyes calm. The pilots were not formally arrested because paperwork burdens truth. They were secured. Ropes, not chains. Words, not rights. Harlan told them they were trespassing in a restricted test area and would be debriefed, then released. He told them to keep the details of the landing to themselves for reasons of national security. He spoke as if national security were a person in the room. The barn used for the debrief sat half a mile from the compound fence, close enough for the smell of disinfectant to cut through dust. Inside, everything got small. Shepard stood to the side with a clipboard he did not look at. He saw a lead pilot who had run out of airspeed but not nerve. Mercer asked straight questions. Why the route change? Why the cameras pulled? Why the fuel line tampering? Harlan answered none of them. He said something else instead, a sentence Shepard remembered word for word. You saw what isn't there. It was not a threat. It was a diagnosis. Mercer did the math quickly, as if he had been rehearsing it in the back of his head for weeks. Families. Graves. The kind of closure that lies to protect the living. He made an offer no training manual contemplates. Stage what everyone will accept. Bury the planes in formation. Leave bodies where they belonged to explain the impossible. Write the letters that duty requires. Don't turn 3 disappearances into a rumor so loud it swallows our names. He negotiated his own ending with the discipline he had used to hold a glide path. It was not surrender. It was a tactic to salvage dignity from machinery designed to erase it. Shepard, young then and dead sure he was already compromised, stood close enough to hear Mercer say, quietly enough to keep it theirs, if this is how it has to be, do it clean. Redding put a hand on Ortega's shoulder. The youngest shook and apologized for shaking. Mercer told him to look at them, not at the men with clipboards. He asked Shepard one favor, tell the truth somewhere it can't be burned. The doctor kept that promise in the concrete room Ava would open almost 80 years later. Nothing here needs gore to be understood. A medical officer administered protocol with professional hands. The room stayed quiet. The light fell in long strips through the gaps. They asked to keep the canopies open and to face inward so they could see each other. It is not sentiment to say they held on. It is a fact drawn from a witness who had no reason to embellish and every reason to forget. Harlan stood in the door and out of the light and watched the thing he had ordered play out with a stillness that reads as conviction from one angle and emptiness from another. Outside, engines idled. Shovels waited. When the salt closed over the canopies that evening, the desert looked whole again. The paperwork moved on its own schedule. The search flew to the wrong squares by design. 3 families learned a version that kept parades tidy. In a windowless office, someone wrote that test protocols had remained uncompromised. In a different room, Shepard signed a lease for a parcel of wasteland in Fish Springs and carried boxes down a ladder no one else knew existed. The hinge on secrecy did not squeal. It whispered. And yet one sentence was left in the open on purpose, pressed into a margin, tucked into a trunk, addressed to a future that might still care. News doesn't break, it leaks, then it surges. By the time Ava and Shepard climbed out of the Fish Springs bunker under careful hands and tighter instructions, files had already left the desert. Reporters who had never said Sequoia on air said it twice in a sentence. An editor in New York published the first transfer orders before anyone in Washington could craft a sentence with the word context. A radio host in Salt Lake read signatures aloud like names of the missing, his voice catching on Harlan as if it were a bone. The story didn't wait for permission. It never does once the paper is real. The men at the hatch backed down when state police arrived with cameras in their wake. Nobody wanted footage of federal suits cuffing a professor's daughter and a dying physician beside a concrete lid stamped with a government font. Shepard's face had gone the gray of a storm when it changes its mind. He asked for water and for a pen. He wrote a short affidavit on the hood of a cruiser with hands that shook but didn't fail. He named structures, not just villains. He drew arrows linking units to budgets and budgets to companies that still bought glossy ads in Sunday magazines. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for accuracy. At Hill Air Force Base, a ceremony took shape faster than policy. Flags. A band that knew what to play because grief writes the set list. 3 chairs with 3 names and no bodies, because the salt keeps its habits even when it surrenders secrets. Ava spoke like a historian and a granddaughter, which is to say with facts that made room for breath. Patriotism, she said, is not obedience to silence. It's care for people over programs. Some in the crowd nodded, some didn't. A veteran in a faded flight jacket saluted a space over her shoulder and didn't put his hand down until the bugle finished. Washington tried 2 stories at once. One called Sequoia an aberration contained by brave men in the bureaucracy, as if a stain could be boxed. The other insisted the records were misread, a vocabulary problem masquerading as scandal. Neither story survived contact with the binder pulled from the conduit drawer. Payment schedules cut across administrations like stitches. Internal memos discussed continuity of study cohorts, in clipped language that wore a smile and meant offense. The pharmaceutical firm issued a statement about legacy processes and then, 2 days later, quietly replaced a board member whose surname appeared 3 times in Shepard's charts. Markets did what markets do, flinched, then recalculated. Families split along the fault lines that always appear when truth costs rent. Some accepted settlements framed as restoration of benefits, numbers arranged to look like respect. Some said no, slowly, once, forever. A young lawyer who had never argued anything bigger than a zoning case assembled 27 plaintiffs, then grew the list to 43. The complaint read like a map of omissions. It added the simplest cause of action, the one that holds even when other bridges fail: wrongful death. Each name on it made the air heavier and, somehow, cleaner. Harvey Redding spoke to a local paper at his kitchen table with his hand on Cole's letter. He said his brother liked peach pie and flying in weather other men declined. He said he could forgive a lot but not the way the search grid was drawn. Eleanor Voss sat for 1 interview and then none. She walked the flats alone at dawn, as she had for 70 years, and left 3 stones in a triangle where the earth had been disturbed. Sergeant Dwyer's son drove from Phoenix with a cardboard box his father had labeled with a date and a curse at himself. Inside lay a grease pencil, a copy of the maintenance order, and a note that said I knew and didn't stop it. He asked Ava if history had room for cowards who didn't run. She told him history has room for everything. Justice is the smaller house. Shepard lasted a season. He used what days he had to sign more paper and record a statement too careful to be theater. He refused the word whistleblower. He preferred witness. When he died, he did it without ceremony in a room with a window. The obituary in the town paper called him a physician and didn't name the decades he spent stitching together a record he had helped shred. Ava went to his burial and stood far back. She didn't forgive him, and she didn't need to. That wasn't the transaction on offer. In the year after the vault, a retired aide to Harlan was indicted on conspiracy and obstruction. He was 98 and wheeled into court past cameras that couldn't decide on a respectful angle. The indictment read like a footnote grown up. It satisfied no one fully, which may be the only honest outcome in a case where most of the architects died warm in their beds. The court released a trove of documents under pressure that smelled like sunlight. Researchers found euphemisms with teeth. Teachers made new units for classes that didn't have room before. Monuments added plaques. Airmen came to stand at the edge of the flats and touch the wind as if it could carry apologies. Ava kept a copy of Jack's map above her desk, the graphite block of Sector 9 smudged by years of fingers. She visited Tonopah once, stood at the end of the runway at 2:33 p.m., and let the sound of modern engines overdub the silence from another century. She thought about 3 men who negotiated the only dignity left and left enough evidence for a granddaughter not yet born to pry open a door. She didn't call what followed closure. She called it consequence. It doesn't change the past. It changes how the past behaves in the present. We don't get perfect justice here. We do get a ledger that's harder to lie on. The lesson is small and heavy. Tell the truth early if you can, late if you must, and leave it where hands can find it. Choose people over secrecy when the two collide. And remember that the silence you protect today may be the one your children have to break.